All right, and we're recording. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of News on China, a deeper dive. This is a new name we're going with for now, which is where we dive into a little bit more depth the news clippings that show up on Dongsheng's channel over on YouTube here. Just going, your clips are 60-second clips, which kind of give the headlines, and we're going to go into a little bit more detail here as usual. This is one of the most fun things I do on my channel, so I always look forward to this. We skipped a week though, didn't we?
Yeah.
We
Holiday.
yeah. You
Can't
shouldn't
exploit the
admit
workers too much.
you shouldn't admit you were slacking. You should have been like, oh yeah, it's just busy. Now everybody knows you were on a beach in Hainan again somewhere. But you did.
Following the masses. Following the masses.
Yeah,
This is
yeah. But it was cool because we got to meet up again in Shenzhen, which was really great. That was fun. So it was worth missing a week. But we're back now. We're back, and we're gonna take a dive into what is your 40th episode. I think we're on number 40. Is that right?
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. So what we'll do first, maybe what we'll start with is we'll start with your video, your summary video, which shows up on your channel, and then we'll choose some of the headlines that you'd like to talk about, and we'll go from there. So let's start with the clip here if I have it loaded. Here we go. Awesome. There we go. There's the 60-second clip. All right. So from here, let's go into a deeper dive as we say in the title. So what do you want to start with first in terms of the first story up?
Okay, so first story, we're going to start as a hook. It's this news about China European Union trade. It's a big story actually. It's actually not from this week, but because of the holiday, everything. So we are also have some luck, and we are bringing this story back. Because I mean, first of all, it's historical. It's interesting because we did a lot of research, and most of the news are not putting this like in a historical, broader sense. But what happens is just China surpassed US this last year, 2020, and became the biggest or the most important trade partner of European Union. The trade between them reached a 710 billion US dollars. And also we have to remember that in December, they just signed an also very important historical new agreement, with the comprehensive agreement for investments, which actually has been discussing and negotiating for, I think, 8 years or something like that. And it's still actually this pact is still not 100% approved because there are some forces in the European Union, and of course the US is already putting a lot of pressure to try to boycott this agreement, of course, as we know. But in terms of data, also it's interesting. What happened with the China surplus also grew 9.9% last year, and the comparison with the US. The trade, so European Union China trade reached 710 billion, and the US European Union trade reached 671, and there was a drop of 10% in the trade last year. Of course, this has to do a lot with the pandemic because it's China and US right now. It's like the sort of like the negative and the positive. It's like really the opposite realities right now. But this is also, I think, in the bigger picture, what we had in 2020 in terms of the date of trade was that China, of course, is becoming a sort of like a, I don't know how to call it, maybe like a planet or a sun, which is attracts everybody to its own realm, to its own universe. Because
Hmm.
I mean, the power of Chinese economy is just growing, and of course, the West is having a hard time, not only with the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, the economy in Europe and in US were not growing as faster as like 20, 30 years ago. So of course, China is also taking advantage of that. But also besides the issue of European Union, there's also interesting story lately about Japan. You know that Japan and China has a very problematic history. I mean,
Right.
I'm
Yeah.
not going to talk about. I mean, all the invasions, imperialism, Japan killed like tens of millions of Chinese in many years of wars. But actually, Japan, after all, had a very important role in the reform and opening up of the Chinese economy since 1978. By the way, we had a great experience in Shenzhen. We also recommend to everybody who can. It's the Shenzhen Museum. We
Right.
went last week. There's one of the sections of the museum is about the reforming and opening up. There's the whole story and the role of course Shenzhen was like the protagonistic. It was the most important place in China for that. But it's interesting because there's been a lot of tensions, of course, between China and Japan, even the last years. But at the same time, Chinese economy is still like hugely central to the Japanese economy and to the Japanese companies. So what happened is that in the last 2 years, more or less, Japan was trying, especially the last year with the pandemic, Japan was trying to bring back some of its main companies
I remember
from
that they were
China.
offering
Yeah,
incentives, right? Yeah.
exactly. They offer overall more or less 2 billion US dollars, but guess what? Very few companies accepted. Actually, they made a research lately and found out that just 7.2% of the companies that were surveyed said that they are considering to go back to Japan or to move into Vietnam
Hmm.
or Thailand or Southeast Asian countries. So, but that's the problem. So there was a interesting article in Nikkei a few days ago talking about that and how
Hmm.
actually they were saying that despite of all the subsidies, despite of the political pressure from Japanese government, from U.S. government, the big companies in Japan, they just say, I'm sorry, we are doubling down on China. I mean, we depend of Chinese market, and there's no option because what you have in China, it's a unique combination of course, the size of the market, 1.4 billion people, and middle class is growing a lot, as we discussed a few weeks ago. You have a very skilled labor force, very good education, very good training, and you also have the best supply chain you can get in the country for many of the sectors of the production. So, for instance, two examples. This is something very smart that China has been doing in the last years. So, for instance, when they attract Apple, Apple has a huge market in China, of course, and most of the production of Apple, almost like I don't know, 89%, is done in China. But what happened when they attract Apple? They don't only attract Apple, they attract the whole supply chain around Apple, the thousands of small components that goes in the cell phone, the softwares, everything. So what happened is that they created a fact. They call it like what is it called? I forgot the name. It's like a funny name. I'm gonna remember.
Catfish effect.
Catfish effect. Yes. So this is like a business sort of concept. So you bring like a big fish to the pond that actually destroys everyone around. But what actually happens is that China, at the same time, they know that okay, we bring Apple, they will create like a very sophisticated supply chain. We are going to have hard time. Our Chinese companies have a hard time, maybe in the first 5, 10 years. But later, guess what? We're going to learn. And we're going to have also access to this sophisticated supply chain. So that happened in Apple, and right now it's happening with Tesla. It's exactly the same now. It's happening with Tesla. They just brought Tesla to China. There's like a here in Shanghai. There's a huge factory, more than $1 billion factory. Actually, Tesla had a privilege because they came without being obliged to do a joint venture with a Chinese company, because that was the model for all the
Right.
foreign
Yeah.
companies in the last 40 years. Okay, you come to China, but you have to make a joint venture with our companies. You have access to the market, but you're gonna teach us how to do
Right.
it. We're transfer
But
technology.
this is more independent.
Exactly. Tesla didn't have to do that. There was a lot of controversial here. There's a lot of criticism because of that from Chinese people, some of the Chinese specialists. But then what they say, it's okay, don't worry. Tesla is coming. It's going to be the same as Apple. They're going to bring the whole supply chain around them. We're going to have the best supply chain to electric cars, vehicles. And guess what? 2, 3, 5 years, Chinese companies are going to be number one. So this is a very smart sort of mechanism that they actually been developing the last 40 years. But that was the basic thing that made China like a huge, or the factory of the world right now, because they didn't have, of course, anything of that. So just for one
Right.
comparison between the Chinese economy and Japanese economy. So in 2000, Japan's economy was 4 times bigger than Chinese economy. 2000, 21 years ago. In 2010, 10 years, China surpassed Japan, biggest GDP. In last year, 2020, Chinese economy became 3 times the size of Japanese economy. So you have 12 times in 20 years. That was the rate between Chinese and Japanese economy.
Right.
So, I mean, Japanese companies is saying, I mean, I'm sorry, Abe, now it's Suga, the prime minister. I mean, you don't have enough.
I saw one of the hooks they were trying to use to try to pull Japanese companies back was that, you know, you are at the mercy of politics. You know, the politics could change and all of a sudden you're kicked out of the country or something like that. And, you know, I guess there's risks for that anywhere. I mean, they should know that better than anybody else. Well, first of all, you can see it now happening with obviously TikTok, Huawei, and everything like that operating with the U.S. But it's not only about China, right? I mean, the U.S. Did one over on Alstom, but even the Japanese themselves, when they were the number one chip maker in the world, I mean, the U.S. government really did a lot to undermine that. Where, you know, I think it was you telling me they were smashing the Japanese TVs outside of, you know, Congress and doing these campaigns, which they basically destroyed the chip market in Japan and basically had it a lot of it move over to South Korea. South Korea was a big beneficiary of that effort to kind of take away some of Japan's power. So, I mean, there's risks, even if that statement is true, there's risks to deal with the U.S. as well. And it seems like they're voting by saying, well, you know, it's worth the risk. And if you look at the companies that didn't turn away from China, then it's obviously turned out really well for them. I think it was Toyota you were saying was saying that was one of their biggest mistakes, to not focus on the Chinese market and say, no, we're going to focus on the U.S. or focus elsewhere. And now I think they've got some new, if I remember correctly, they've got some new fuel cell technologies where they're saying we're not going to miss China on this one, and they're cooperating with China and they're coming in with them now.
Exactly. No, that story, this article, I mean, you guys can see in the digest later. In a few hours, going to launch. It's from Nikkei. It's very interesting. It starts actually with the Deng visiting Japan to look for help. So he goes to the Panasonic factory. At that point, it was another name, but in Osaka. And then he's going to get amazed. And he turns out to the guy who's Matsushita, who's like one of the heads of the managers, and say, oh, Sir Matsushita-san, we know that you are called the god of management. Can you help us to develop our economy? And Matsushita say, yes, okay, let's do it. So, and they came. So Panasonic now, it's one quarter of Panasonic revenue comes from China. And they are actually now considering to move one of his headquarters to China for appliances. I mean, they have more than 50,000 workers in China right now. So that's the
Yeah.
story.
Yeah, that's amazing. So obviously they took the risks and it played out really well for them, and they haven't really hit any major roadblocks to get to the point where, as you said, a quarter of their revenue is based on China. Yeah, no, that's quite interesting. So did you have any more on that topic, or do you want to move on to the next one, which is kind of related in some ways? Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
one thing, just one thing, one data, because maybe we can bring back next week. But also, like in the last days, the data about China and India trade was announced, and guess what? China surpassed US and became again the number one trading partner for India. So I mean, the Quad will have a hard time because India, Australia, Japan, they they depend a lot on the
I
trade
think
with
And
China.
the
yeah.
US.
And the US, of course. So
Yeah, I think you've got to. I think the logical thing that's going to happen, and you're seeing it now already, is that you're going to see a real push to up the game on the anti-China propaganda because of that. I mean, China. That's the best bet that the U.S. has. I mean, for the U.S. to destabilize a government or something that they don't like or is a threat to their corporate interests, it's easier with these smaller, weaker countries, but it's a different game with China. So I think the number one thing that they're going to do, and you're going to see more and more of this, is just try to really bash China in the media and get countries to a point where they can guilt them and saying, how could you deal with a country like this? And I think you're seeing that with you're seeing a lot of that with Europe, but even despite that, the numbers are still not going in the direction they want. So I think you're going to see more effort on that end. But yeah, all right. So yeah, we want to go on to the. I think you had a story about the debt trap. Debt trap debunk. Yeah. So you want to go ahead with that?
So, big buzzword, debt trap diplomacy. So this last week, one of the, key scholars that we've been following, Deborah Brodegum, who's from the China-Africa Research Initiative out of Johns Hopkins. So she published an article, I guess early in the month in the Atlantic, debunking or the allegations around this debt trap diplomacy. And going back a bit, how this buzzword came to be was from Mike Pence in 2018. And really circulated around a project in Sri Lanka, the Hambantota Port Project. Won't go too much in the details of this, but the Atlantic article and her studies that came out last year, the group that published these findings, basically have refuted very strongly after reviewing thousands of Chinese loans, 1,000 of them on the African continent, that there is actually no proof that of Chinese, what they call asset seizures. So if there are loans that are unpaid or, countries are failing to meet those requirements, oftentimes there's this idea that China comes in and takes over whatever asset it is. And so they've studied thousands of these loans and haven't found any evidence of that. So, but looking specific into Africa, I think there's some, because obviously that's a hotspot of where we're thinking about where loans and debt are. China holds 20% of Africa's debts. That is a significant amount, which also means that 80% of Africa's debt's not being held by China, which is often lesser told about. And we mentioned it briefly, I think once a few weeks ago, but on the case of Zambia, for example, a few months ago and kind of deep into the pandemic, Zambia became one of the first countries in Africa set to default on their loans. And there was a lot of news focusing on Chinese debt trap diplomacy again. China currently holds 3 billion out of the 12 billion of loans. And what's interesting, and it's actually in this report too of Deborah and the Kari Institute, is that the head of the Economics Association of Zambia, his name is Lubinda Hasbozoka, sorry for the pronunciation, he said, it's not the $3 billion worth, it's not the Chinese loans that's a problem. It's actually the 3 billion worth of Eurobonds. Because you can't, and I'm quoting him, you don't play around when the payments are due. Chinese debt can easily be renegotiated, restructured, or refinanced. So this is the Zambian head of head economist speaking here. And it's a very telling And the report goes into much deeper detail about how the structure of Chinese loans is quite different from let's say, the Western alternatives. We know quite famously, I'm sure many of your listeners know, after the 1989 Washington Consensus, the 1990s was characterized by the World Bank and WTO, IMF, creating loans across the global south, but heavily affecting African continent, that required a huge amounts of structural adjustment programs. So the privatizing of public assets and services, and came with extreme,
austerity.
Austerity now
measures.
It's called austerity, but
yeah.
debilitating measures for countries that are still, quite young, newly out of the grasp of colonialism. Let's say this is still in the 1990s. Many of these countries were still just coming into, let's say, South Africa was just coming into independence in 1994, to give some historical context.
Right.
But on the other hand, we have Chinese loans that have a very different character. They're negotiable. They have sort of tailor-made solutions. They can be restructured. They don't focus on the punitive measures that some of you might have heard of the Paris Club, which is the arm of the G20, G7 countries that help organize how debt repayment is made, especially for countries that are about to default on their debt. And it's often been called as the creditors cartel, just as a little bit about how it operates.
Paris cartel.
It's called the Paris cartel. And they keep consistently trying to tell China to join, but China has consistently refused. And I think it's also based on the fact that the nature of the relations are different and how they deal with debt and loans. So just for one example, in Nigeria, for 17.8 billion debt that they accrued, the Paris Club put in punitive penalties on arrears of $4 billion, just on the debt that they were unable to pay.
Right.
This is the kind of stuff that you won't see.
It's mafia.
That's mafia.
It's basically how mafia does.
You won't
Well,
see.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the important things are the conditions that come with a lot of those loans from the global north as well. Some of those conditions were not being able to give subsidies on agricultural products and things like that. Like it is designed in such a way to keep these countries down, to keep them poor enough where their resources can be exploited for really, really low prices. And I think one thing is no matter what people want to say about the Chinese option, if these countries, if you want to believe that the China cooperative method in Africa, Latin America, all these places is really terrible, you really want to think they're terrible options, these countries are choosing to deal with China. So if China's option is so terrible, how much more terrible must your option be if they're choosing that? I mean, this is a basic logical question that people need to ask themselves. And then from there, they can dig a little bit deeper and say, okay, well, what's really going on here? And then they can find the things that you're saying, that the loans can be restructured really easily. They don't come with so many pressures attached to them. And then, of course, there's less of a risk of your government being overthrown in a violent coup and being replaced by a dictator. But these are things we've spoken about in great detail. And this is a difficult thing to load onto somebody and say, okay, well, here's the big picture. But start with some of these basic questions, and then start to figure out a little bit more. But you're right, yeah. Obviously the one that sorry, I don't know if you were going to mention this, but the one that everybody usually refers to, and I don't know if you've got more information on this you can share, but the one example they always use and they hold on to is the Sri Lanka port. The port where they say, oh, you see, this is an example of China debt trap diplomacy. Do you have some more details on that you could share?
Yeah, exactly. That's the one that kind of popularized, let's say, this myth or this allegation, right? I mean, the Sri Lankan port is an interesting example. First of all, we have to put it in the context of a country that has gone through extreme amounts of political upheaval and violence. Also, we have to remember 2004, one of the greatest tsunamis happened. So this has been in recent history a place that has extreme kinds of instability.
Decades of civil war with the Tamil Tigers also. Yeah,
absolutely. So the thing is, what happens is would be probably in the early actually brings in the Canadians here. It was actually a Canadian CETA Bank, the Canadian International Development Agency. So initially, the port project was backed by the Canadians. It fell through, didn't happen. Sri Lanka wants to make this port happen. Ports are very important for the development of the country. They try to go to India for financial support. They deny them. They try to go to US for support. They deny them. And finally, the option of China comes into the picture. This is still in the early days of China kind of becoming let's say, a real global lender. So they did do several loans totaling over $1 billion to make this port happen. And oftentimes the kind of debt or crisis that Sri Lanka experienced in the 2000s is seen as, China's fault. China put them in that context. But I think to remember is that that vast majority of the debt that they were really burdened by wasn't the Chinese debt. At the point of, I think in mid 2000, by 2015, when the elections were happening, the last elections were happening, Sri Lanka had already accrued $15 billion worth of debt from very expensive Eurobonds and high interest loans, usually coming from Western powers. The actual amount of Chinese debt was very low. So there's a much bigger context between environmental crisis to political instability to Western debt burden that was really pressuring this government. So when they were going to be defaulting on the Chinese loan and the port project, they actually sought out China to say, hey, we want you to help us with this. And they entered into a public-private partnership, bringing in a Chinese company. I think it's the China Merchant Group, to help kind of finance that project. China, it's true. Chinese enterprises have 70%, the majority share ownership. But let's be honest, how it works, the actual terms of the loan were shifted at that point too. So that means all the revenue that comes through the port is not going in to pay the Chinese debt. It's actually going back into the treasury so that they can relieve some of their debt pressures. So that's very important to say that this kind of restructuring situation was not to benefit to make sure that they, pay the debt up for China itself, right? It goes back to
it's basically creating. Yeah, so it's creating additional revenue opportunities for Sri Lanka that they wouldn't otherwise be able to realize. I mean, if anybody knows how to operate ports, it's definitely China. So that's an interesting element to the story. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just one thing to say is that I would recommend people to have a look at this article too in the next digest that Marco mentioned, and is that the Chinese choice is an important one, and I don't know if you wanted to jump in before I go into.
No, go ahead.
So I think actually maybe this is a good time now for you to pull up that image from the Africa Weekly, so we can make that point.
Sure.
I don't know if you have it.
So this is
kind
the
of screenshot. Yeah. So
this one here.
Yeah, this is a little plug. So we do the kind of global digest, the larger digest that comes out every Saturday. But as of a few weeks ago, we started this project with some colleagues in Africa to publish a supplement or the Africa Weekly on some of these stories. So this debt trap story goes in there, and folks can subscribe if you feel so interested. And in that, there's always a nugget that we look into moments in Africa-China history. And this particular issue that came out yesterday on Friday is around looking at Ghana and China relations, which really links back to this idea of debt trap and the history of why infrastructure, why cooperation has been so important. Just bringing us back a little bit, it's a bit of a deviation, but I think it might be interesting for your listeners, is that in the 1960s, Ghana, which was a new young socialist country, and China were key proponents of what was called the non-aligned movement, that they were part of this developing the spirit of cooperation amongst the newly independent countries. I love this image. That's Zhou Enlai and Kwame Nkrumah, the first independent and socialist president of Ghana. They're playing ping pong on his visits to China.
Ping pong diplomacy.
Yeah, ping pong.
Nice.
Something else. But just going back, Nkrumah was an impressive leader, but he understood very well what is the importance of infrastructure and in developing robust infrastructure for really maintaining, for countries to maintain independence and not slipping back into what is called neocolonialism. He wrote an important book called Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism in 1965. And the main thing he was saying in this was it's not about pushing out foreign capital. It's about how the capital is used to develop the national project. And it's whether you're working with, let's say, socialist countries or even capitalist countries or mixed economy countries. It is about let's say, the spirit of cooperation and the non-interference to sovereign nations, but actually bringing in this cooperative method. This is where it comes from when we think back into this legacy and how China approaches loans till today, and how China approaches Africa-China relations is based on the spirit that came out of the 1950s, 60s, 70s. So that gives a little context. And so the next image is the moment in history that we want to highlight this week, because just 3 days ago was the anniversary of the what that the Ghanaian comrades actually call the Day of Shame. It's the day that the CIA-backed coup in the country overthrew Nkrumah's rule. This was on 24th of February 1966, just a year after Nkrumah was writing this book on neocolonialism. And actually, what's interesting is he was actually in China during the moment when this happened, and it was Zhou Enlai that told him and gave him the news of this. But just to, I think, linking back to this whole debt trap diplomacy question, is that the China choice is around agency, is around how infrastructure is key to the independence of formerly colonized countries that's still fighting this. We're seeing this in every one of the stories we bring. That story has not been over. And how debt and the relations of debt since the first loan that China gave to an African country, which is Guinea, in 1960, has followed this kind of principle. Of course, it's evolved because the nature of the world has evolved, but has much of the spirit still embedded as you study actually how the loans work, how the terms work. And it is, compared to the Washington Consensus, or what is the other alternative that you mentioned, for many countries, there is no other alternative. This alternative is the one that they have chosen, and I think something that we need to historically contextualize always.
Yeah, no, definitely. And that goes to show, too, the risks to these countries exist. Even if you choose not to deal with America, they'll still, a lot of the times, especially if you go in a socialist direction, they're going to come in and fix that for you. But yeah, that's something we've talked about a lot. Yeah, so I have some of the notes here from your bullet points here. China ended up rescheduling a lot of the debt, interest free, changing it to interest free. I think you covered some of this a little bit, but it definitely does seem
just a little point on that. Oh, go.
Yeah, no. I'm just saying it does seem like these points I'm looking at and looking into it. It does seem to fit the spirit of giving these countries agency, as you said.
And a lot of this is actually, especially in the early period from 1960, from the first debt to, let's say, the 80s, 90s period. Yes, interest-free, grace periods, and really the long repayment schedule. Some of them were actually rescheduled, like delayed for up to 10 times without these punitive, penalties, because that's actually necessary. And the data is actually 2.65 billion was rescheduled over this period between 1960 and 1995. And only 14% was actually ever repaid. So a lot of this was also seen as an act of, let's say, like, it's about solidarity as well. These types of loans, which obviously has shifted in the 90s, that went towards more of these commercial loans for infrastructure. But it's a history that's impressive when you look at it's a completely different from the Washington Consensus, where, Nigeria can get 4 billion in arrears slapped onto a $17 billion loan. It's something pretty impressive when you look at the actual numbers.
Yeah, no, definitely. No, that's interesting. Okay, and you're gonna have some articles that people can link to, so they can read a little bit more on that, and then we can move into digital currency, which has relationships to Africa as well, probably with the possible future use cases. But let's talk about that. What's going on with the digital currency?
Well, so there was a big announcement this last week that China has just set agreement with SWIFT. So let's just try to understand. I mean, for those who doesn't know, we might not know what SWIFT is, but everybody depends on SWIFT.
SWIFT knows who we are.
SWIFT knows who we are. SWIFT is basically a huge global financial transaction system that every transaction, or most of the transactions you do, interbanks, or if you send money to your parents in another country, or if a company wants to pay another company for some service like billions of dollars, they use SWIFT. This is the way that they transfer money internationally. But
Right.
basically, what SWIFT is based in Belgium, but actually what SWIFT became is, I mean, to be like in a good English, is the way the US controls every country in the world. Because the US has the power to shut off a country from SWIFT. This is what exactly they have done, for instance, with Iran since 2012. They did a few years ago with Venezuela. Cuba has the same problem. I mean, when they want to really, really go after a country, they just click a button, they're out of SWIFT. So it means that they cannot make transfers in dollars. And of course, dollars is the hegemonic currency of the world by far. It's almost 50% of all the transactions in the world are made with US dollars. So this is actually, when we talk about weapons of mass destruction, I mean, we think about bombs, missiles, nuclear bomb, etc. But actually, SWIFT is the biggest weapon that US has to confront countries that
destroy a country and its and the livelihood of its people.
Exactly. This is, I mean, right now in Venezuela, if you see the situation of the country, imagine the country who has the biggest oil reserve in the globe, and the economy is collapsed. Inflation was like 800,000% in the last years. It's crazy. They are just destroying the country. And right now, Venezuela cannot, for instance, they cannot even produce most of the oil or process the oil, because the factories, they need maintenance, they need new machines, but they cannot buy because they don't have US
Right.
dollars. And the dollars they have in both London and US were just seized by UK and by US. So that's the situation.
I can't remember. I don't know if you know the story. It was either an Iranian oil tanker or a Venezuelan one where the U.S. seized it. They basically just stole it, and then they sold the oil. They sold the oil recently, I think last month or something like that, and they donated it to a charity of their choice. Like, it was like, this is like,
Yeah, no,
they're
it's crazy.
They're pirates.
Exactly. I mean, Iran actually was able to send a few, what is it called, the ship, the
Containers?
but the
Tankers.
Tankers,
oil
yeah.
tankers, to help Venezuela with processed fuel, etc. But yeah, but once in a while,
That was it. They
aggressive.
seized one of those. Yeah. They seized one of those, and then they sold it themselves. It's like, what? Imagine if China did that, with the country that they decided wasn't legitimate. Oh man, no, it's unbelievable. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Go. No, this is SWIFT. Just for people to understand what SWIFT is and what is the big deal. First of all, of China launching. China is going to probably be the first major economy to launch the digital currency. I mean, this is there's some technicalities. I mean, to be honest, I don't even know all of them. But basically, China is creating a way, is the DCEP, the Digital Currency Electronic Payment. It was actually different. I mean, probably you can tell us more about Bitcoins, because we know that you know about that. But this is a different from Bitcoin, because this is centralized by the Central Bank of China, by the People's Bank of China. So there's going to be the first state controlled digital currency. But the first thing is that this will allow much more trade between China and other countries, especially in Africa right now, Belt and Road Initiative countries. But this, in the future, will also allow countries to make transactions with the Yuan, just like we do with the US dollar. So, I don't know, Brazil makes a trade with Ghana in US dollars.
Yeah.
They have to convert. So Go ahead. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
yeah. No. So I was going to say what some of the interesting components for me. I mean, first of all, when you were down here in Shenzhen, you told me that they signed an agreement with Swift. I was like, what? This is what they're
Yeah.
trying to get away from, but they're actually signing a partnership with them. They could literally leave Swift in the dust. It's a 50-year-old system with all kinds of inefficiencies. Sometimes transactions need to go through multiple banks, and Swift isn't really a payments. It doesn't actually transfer the payments. It's almost like a ledger, also not a blockchain ledger, but it's a ledger, and then the actual funds need to be transferred underneath on a second layer system. So it's just a terrible, old, outdated, ancient system, but they're signing an agreement with them. If you compare the digital renminbi, when you make a transaction, it is both the ledger and it is the currency. When you transfer digital renminbi, that is the digital renminbi that holds the value. It's all in one. So that you own the money when it gets transferred to you. So it's far superior. Blockchain technology is to a point where they can trust a system like this too. It's far more superior. Presumably, it'll be more transparent. Like a lot of people, they have a misconception about Bitcoin that it's like untraceable, or drug dealers and all these things use it and stuff like that. But it's a public ledger, and you can see everything on the system. There are privacy coins also, like Zcash, Dash, Monero, and some of these other cryptocurrencies. I don't think the Chinese digital currency will act like that. But yeah, it will have some form of centralized control, but it uses all the benefits of blockchain, where I think it will instill a lot of trust. But that was a really interesting point for me, that they decided to say, hey, Swift, come along with us. We'll that was yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, we did some research, and I mean, we still couldn't find proper analysis about that, because I was when we were talking last week, was like, but how?
Yeah.
But how the U.S. didn't react yet? I mean, also curious about what's going to be U.S. reaction, because this is basically China, like bringing is like we are making a joke, like keep your friends close and your enemies closer, like in Godfather. So I mean, sounds like more or less this move. But one thing I would like to ask you, because they actually last year they did domestic tests, right, in three cities, and I think Shenzhen was one of the cities.
Yeah, it was a specific district. It was Lohu district on the other side of town. Otherwise, we would have definitely given it a try. And they gave out, I think it was 200 renminbi to each person. Yeah. And they're trying to make it into a payment system on the ground also, where you can use your digital renminbis directly.
Yeah.
I know some people at Ant Financial. They don't seem very concerned about that aspect of it. I think they see it's going to be more of a layered thing. It will work with a lot of other technologies together. And there's still a huge infrastructure that needs to be built around it. But I do get the sense, though, that perhaps the Chinese government doesn't want to give the new digital economy 100% to private industry. So they're trying to get their foot in the door also. I mean, they obviously there's a socialism aspect, and this is going to be a very, very important part of the future. And if they have no foot in the door at all, and it's completely owned by private industry, the future of digital payments, I don't think that's something that they want. They want to have some hand in it also. And this is very different also, because obviously when you use Alipay, when you use WeChat Pay and all this stuff, it's, again, just a ledger. You're not actually, it's still, there's an underlying system that's transferring the actual money, but this digital renminbi that you own is the actual currency. It's hard for people to wrap their minds around it, because they think that underneath it all, there still needs to be some piece of paper backing it up or something like that. But no, in this case, it is the actual digital currency sitting on your wallet. And that's the interesting thing too. Nobody's going to need any banks for this. If people in Africa wanted to start trading with the digital renminbi, anybody with a phone, they don't need to have access to a bank. And there are so many unbanked people in Africa also. So this is going to be potentially revolutionary for a lot of people, especially in developing countries.
And also, guess what? I mean, it's true. I mean, you're not going to need a bank account, but it's going to be even more, because now Huawei already launched a system that will allow you to transfer money from cell phone to cell phone without even internet. So imagine you are going to be able, in the middle of nowhere in Africa, or even in China, rural, or Latin America, you're going to be able to do like small shops going to like be able to sell stuff. People are going to do trade without bank account and without internet. So that's going to be revolutionary, and that's also probably one of the bets of China, is because it's to internationalize yuan, really, because right now this is probably the main Chinese weakness in terms of the global economy. It's the very low use of yuan internationally. Yuan is used in 2%, more or less 2% of the transactions globally, and the same number for international reserves is only 2%. So right now, China is not a global player in terms of currency, and of course, they know this is a weakness. And DCEP, the digital currency, is the next plan for the next years, how to move on that. And of course, BRI countries, they're going to be able to do trade with China without using dollars. There's one interesting case going on right now, which is the trade between China and Russia, because also Russia, I mean, it's also target of like tons of sanctions from U.S., from European Union. Now it's gonna get worse. Actually, it's clear. Biden administration already made it clear. The Democrats, they are just, I mean, Russia is the main target historically. But just one interesting data: last year, the trade between China and Russia, 50% was made with yuans and rubles, which is the Russian currency. So 50%. This is
Wow.
actually the most advanced non-dollar big trade relations in the world right now, is between China and Russia. Because again, both know what is the problem with dollar and what is the risks to rely on dollars to do trade. And the same, I mean, if you see what is it called, the agreement with Iran that China also signed last year, it's like 400 billion US dollars equivalent in 25 years. But also most of the trade is going to be, I mean, Iran giving oil, natural gas, and China building infrastructure for the country. And most of also these transactions are now going to be in dollar, even because Iran
Yeah,
doesn't
access.
have access to US dollars, because US
Well,
just
well, well,
turned it off.
yeah. Yeah, this is the second biggest reason why you're going to see a lot of anti-China propaganda. So the first is the displacement of American interests in resource-rich countries, developing countries, and the second is U.S. dollar hegemony, which is probably even more scary for the U.S. and will create even more of a target on China. I mean, obviously, Gaddafi in Libya, he tried to create an African currency, a gold-backed currency, and that
It
didn't
didn't end
end too well for him.
it
I
didn't
mean,
end up well for him.
I think he could have gone for a little bit longer without that effort. But I mean, this is absolutely revolutionary. I don't think China would have been pushing so much for this kind of reform if America didn't give the world such an incentive to de-risk themselves, to kind of get themselves away from the heavily weaponized U.S. dollar. This is something that they kind of created on their own. It's natural that this would happen, and that's going to be important for China also to not misuse it. We say that the digital renminbi isn't, or sorry, the renminbi isn't used internationally that much. A lot of that was China's doing. There's very strict, heavy capital controls. They were slowly opening it up. Hong Kong became one of the first places for renminbi reform, and they took a very slow approach to it because they know that if they opened up too quickly, both it could destabilize their currency because of predatory practices overseas. It would have opened them up to risk. So this is now they're finally the time that they're finally opening it up and reforming it. They've got a really amazing system that could potentially protect them even more. And when they're ready to move away from kind of relying on the US dollar so much. I mean, all of the timing, everything is lining up perfectly for them to do this. It'll still be interesting to see because obviously there's heavy capital controls in China for outflows and inflows of renminbi. It'll be interesting to see how they handle that because if the renminbi starts being traded or digital renminbi starts being traded on the open market, they're going to lose a little bit of control on that aspect. So there's still a lot of questions up in the air about how exactly are they going to handle this, because traditionally speaking, moving renminbi in and out of China is a very difficult thing, and it's deliberately so. But yeah, we'll see how it goes.
They just announced also last week. They just announced they are increasing the cap of investments. for Chinese people do investments abroad, they are also increasing the cap. This is actually something, I mean, sooner or later we're bringing back, depending on the news of the week, because this is a huge story of how much China is opening up the financial market to the U.S. Actually, to Wall Street is coming with like a lot of like, okay, we're gonna make a lot of money in China. They are actually bringing BlackRock, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs. They are now being able to have companies without joint ventures with Chinese companies, which was they had to. But this is another story. But
that's interesting. I wonder if the angle with that is because at the end of the day, the people who make policy in the U.S. are the corporations who own the politicians, who sponsored these politicians, the millions of dollars it required them to get their Senate seat. So if all of a sudden these, corporations, they're pretty happy with how much they're able to invest in the growing Chinese market. I wonder if that's going to be the thing that shifts U.S. politicians saying, okay, all right, China's not that bad. My sponsor said so. Well, of course, they won't say that. I always say that these politicians, they should be required on the Senate floor to wear like NASCAR jackets with little labels for who sponsored them. And the bigger the sponsor, the bigger the label, like Exxon and, Goldman Sachs. And like they should be required like NASCAR drivers.
That would be real democracy. This is democracy. Transparency, access to information. You're totally right.
That would be awesome. But
demanding that,
Yeah, but that's going to be, you're totally right. That's going to be I think the biggest contradiction inside the U.S. in the next years. It's going to be the interest of the big companies who knows that China, I mean, they can make a lot of money in China, and the interests of the deep state and a part of the ruling class system in the U.S. I mean,
it could be
China.
Yeah. It could be part of a great strategy, though, to get the right people on board. Because, Kishore Mahbubani, in his book, Has China Won? He talks about this. The first set of attacks on China happened, I believe it was in the 90s. There were a lot of Western corporations like Boeing and Microsoft and all these big companies that stood up for China. And the second time, during Trump's era, less people stood up for China. Less of these corporations stood up for China because either they were losing market share, maybe they felt like the practices were unfair, like they had to go into a joint partnership in order to do business in China. And so maybe all of this stuff that's happening, like Tesla's coming in without a joint partnership anymore, they're letting all of these big firms from the U.S. come in. This could change back to what the situation was like in the 90s, according to Kishore Mahbubani's logic, where now these companies will start pushing back and saying, no. Why are you doing this on, we're pretty happy with China. Find a new target. Obviously, there's a lot of different aspects at play here, though, that are going to be fighting with each other. Obviously, the imperialistic goals of countries being displaced in, or companies being displaced in resource-rich countries, the possibility of the U.S. dollar losing its power around the world. So, whether it will necessarily outweigh that or not, I'm not sure. But it's interesting to think about. Maybe that's the underlying intention behind some of these rapid reforms. Who knows? We'll see, though. Yeah.
Exciting years ahead.
Yeah. All right. So I think we've got another story from you, a final story, right?
Yeah. To bring a little culture into this geopolitical. I mean, they're always real interconnected. Especially this one is a very geopolitical, cultural story. Let's say. So the story is about what is called Red Detachment of Women, translated in English. So it is the first all-women's brigade of the Red Army. It was formed in the 1930s in Hainan, that beachline place that you outed us for hanging out in recently.
Did you go there?
We did go.
Oh. Okay. Well, now it's all of a sudden become okay. It's been a research. You can say it was a research trip.
Of course, we're working.
Research.
It was working. By the way,
life is research.
She's too humble to say, but this article is her. It's she's the author of the article, which is coming on the digest. So we were working.
Nice. Okay, so I've got to cut this out and put it in the beginning because it doesn't sound as authentic when you're like, yeah, it was a beach vacation. They're like, oh, it sounds like you're saying this is a better angle. It was totally a research trip.
Thank you for that.
Sounds good. Sponsored by the Department of Tourism of Hainan.
Yeah. You need your NASCAR jacket now also with your Hainan Tourism Department sticker.
Well, with the sticker and the...
Exactly. There you go. This one I'm not ashamed to wear. Exxon, maybe not so much. So anyways, back to the history. 1930s, this is the time when China is fighting two fronts. I mean, at least the communist side is fighting both the nationalists, but then there's also the invasion of the Japanese. And that's to say, in the mix of this, in the subtropical island of Hainan, a brigade forms of 103 women. This is the first time an all-women group was formed. They did many things like, safeguarding arms, stashes, to, securing the safe passage of important leaders, to leading some epic battles. So after winning 3 battles, they gained the official title of being a detachment, an official detachment. So anyways, why is this story relevant today, almost a century later? It's a pretty interesting way to understand how these historical stories, that they like to call it red culture here, get retold and repopularized through popular culture. So the first time the story was reported in the 50s, it was a news story, a local news story, because it's based on a real story. And then 1961 becomes a feature film, one of the films that most people of the previous generation, everyone would have watched it. And the story goes, it's based on Chonghua, who was an enslaved woman and whose family was killed by the tyrant of the South, or a local landlord. So she escapes with the help of another communist cadre and goes to the jungles to join this brigade. And there's some nice scenes in there. It's important, like, how you have the rite of passage. It's like, are you a proletariat? And she's like, I don't know if I'm a proletariat. She's like, well, do you own land? She's like, I'm a slave girl. I've been sold since I was 10. And they're like, oh, then you're definitely proletariat. That's a process of understanding people's class position also as well. But anyway, this film then turns into one of the national opera ballets, one of what was called the 8 model operas during the Cultural Revolution. So, and it's been performed and restaged many, many times since then, 4,000 times since the 1960s. What is interesting too is that this was speaking about geopolitics, in the days actually just past the anniversary of the U.S. President Nixon visit to China, which was on it says February 19th. We figured he arrived February 19th in 1972. So next year is going to be the 50-year anniversary. So of course, this was the historic moment, first president of the United States visiting the People's Republic of China. And in this historic visit, where the beginnings of the rapprochement was happening, this was the cultural piece that was shown to Nixon. The Red Detachment of Women. So
and what year?
Guerrilla
Brigade,
yeah, right.
Women
was actually being shown to President Nixon as like, this is our national opera piece. We'd like to show you, President Nixon. So it's been taken into many, many forms since then. There was a TV series, I think, in the mid-2000s. It's continued to live on even way past the Cultural Revolution period. And bringing us back to Hainan is 2 years ago, a new theme park was created. And this is the place that we actually got to visit. It is a theme park dedicated to the Red Detachment of Women. It was a $185 million project. It is a 2,400 capacity, multi-stage. There's fireworks, there's guns, there's drones, there's fake planes. Wow. There are 300 actors and staff every night. And you see there, what's impressive, it's this, red culture with Chinese characteristics. Everything is big and spectacular. And what's so fantastic when you go there is that you see young kids, and specifically young girls. They're interested, excited. And at the end, it's like a theme park, there's all the vendors, there's like gift shops and, bigger, like all this, fake mountains and all kinds of things. It's really impressive. But all the kids after the show go and run off and take selfies and photos instead of with like a superhero, like, I don't know, name any of them. They're taking it with these actor women in these like Red Army, outfits and girls that they want to aspire to become, or women they want to aspire to become. And what's interesting too for Hainan, I mean, this is a bigger topic, is that last year the master plan was announced for turning this island province into the first free trade port. Like the entire island is going to be turned into free trade port.
Right, and a heavy financial focus on financial also, yeah.
Yeah, and
trade
in
zone.
trade zone, and it's going to be something that's unrivaled. I mean, we're talking about Shenzhen as an experiment, but Hainan will definitely be a kind of the next stage in understanding how to create this entire province into this free trade zone. So, what's interesting too, Premier Li, in the last year's 13th National People's Congress, was talking about how much red tourism and red culture is an important part of this, kind of opening up of the island province. So the amounts of, not only just the post-pandemic recovery, but how elements like this kind of theme park can draw young people, can draw huge amounts of tourism. Like this park is probably rivals all the hottest beaches and tourist destinations on the island. It's one of those top 10 places visited. I had the numbers from the last Golden Week, the Mid-Autumn Festival week. Just a few months ago in August, there was the Youth China Festival, which had like 50,000 people online and 1,000 youth coming together there at the park. And the whole thing was about, young generation, teaching them the spirit of, the Red Detachment of Women and carrying on those footsteps. So it's a fantastic and interesting place to understand how to keep a story alive, a revolutionary, historical story alive for young people and keep it relevant today and make it fun and make it popular. So if anyone gets to go to that beach town, and no, I'm not being sponsored by the Department of Tourism of Hainan, but I would highly recommend checking it out.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, that sounds, and I mean, in terms of the empowerment of women and having these young girls look at these characters and listen to this story and get an idea and a sense that they can do anything they want is really important. I mean, it's really interesting that the movie was made in the 60s. I think you said it was, which is kind of I believe that was around the height of the women's rights movement in the U.S. also. So while that's going on here in China, they've got this feature film featuring these, these female heroes of the revolution. That's really great and important for people to keep in mind who sometimes have a skewed understanding of the appreciation for women's rights in China. But no, interesting story, and that's definitely. I used to go every April when my kids are on holiday down to Hainan. We didn't go last year. With the situation, but if we go there, we're definitely going to check that out. That sounds really interesting. And yeah, so I think that was our last story then, wasn't it?
That was.
Thank God, we talked too much.
Wait, no, it's good. It's just at the hour mark. I know we always said we'll try to do like a short thing, but you know what? It's just too interesting. We're at an hour though, so
shorter.
Yeah, it is. But that's okay. I think what I'll probably do is in the description I'll put like time markers for each topics, each topic we hit. So if somebody's interested in only one of the topics, they can jump to that. I'll try to put that in this video. But so that sounds good.
Yeah, in a few hours, maybe like 10 hours, they can also check the digest with all the articles and more stories actually also that we did.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. All right, well, let's wrap this one up. Hopefully next week, if none of us are sipping pina coladas on a beach, we can do another episode.
It's so cold in Shanghai. There's no pina colada anymore.
Just take your computer with you, and we'll do an episode from the beach. That we can do that.
We'll put a green screen behind us.
Yeah, exactly. All right, no, that sounds good. All right, well, thanks very much for joining again, and we'll wrap this up. And everybody head over to their channel on Dongsheng News to check out their summary videos, and also your website for the new News on Africa, the Africa-focused portion of your newsletter, which is great. Yeah. All right, thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you. 谢谢 Daniel.
Cheers.
I don't. Oh, you got the high-level Wumao. I got this one. This is a bit different. I don't know. You can't see it. It won't change focus. It's a New Year's cup. But yeah.
Oh, nice.
All right, guys. Yeah. Thanks everyone for joining, and we'll catch you next time.